My name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. When, on January 30th, 2025, we hosted the program shared here with you, History and Restorative Justice in Princeton, there were a number of technical and logistical issues that compromised our attempt to bring this program before our virtual audience. Regrettably, those technical problems also confounded the delivery of the program's introduction, wherein I offered some opening remarks and distinguished historian Sharece Blakney shared a presentation. Fortunately, the panel itself was not badly compromised, and it can be presented as a distinct segment. To complement that portion of the original program, we intend to include a new recording of Sharece Blakney's presentation immediately following these contextualizing remarks. This program, as with all programs offered through the library's Public Humanities Initiative, was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are also grateful to our partners, In Our Town Princeton, the Morven Museum Gardens, and the Princeton Theological Seminary for supporting, organizing, and promoting this panel in collaboration with us. I'd be remiss not to identify by name Kim Dorman, the library's Community Engagement Coordinator, Linda Oppenheim, Wilma Solomon, and Shirley Satterfield of In Our Town Princeton, Greer Luce of the Morven Museum Gardens, and Gordon McCoskey of the Princeton Theological Seminary for helping to bring together the impressive group of panelists featured in this program. Thank you for your attention, and please enjoy the program.
At this point, I'd like to welcome our panelists up to their seats, and I'll introduce Brandon McCoy, our moderator. So Brandon is the president of the Fund for New Jersey and an established leader in public policy analysis and advocacy statewide and nationally. Prior to his current position, he worked as the vice president for state partnerships and co-leader of the State Fiscal Policy Division of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. Brandon is well known for his accomplishments from his time at New Jersey Policy Perspective, where he held several roles over the course of 7 years, first as State Policy Fellow through the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities program, next as a policy analyst, then as Director of Government and Public Affairs, before assuming leadership of the organization as NJPP's president from 2019 through late 2021. He returned to the Fund for New Jersey in 2024, and that served as a kind of homecoming for him, given that he worked there originally as a program associate between 2012 and 2014. Brandon, thank you for being here tonight. Panelists, thank you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Oh, this works? Yes? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. One more round of applause for Ms. Satterfield. That was wonderful. It is so important to have sort of, a community understanding of its own history and to have living history as well. So thank you for that presentation and for grounding us in that. And so good evening to all of you, and thank you for being here for this important conversation. Again, I am Brandon McCoy. I'm the president of the Fund for New Jersey, and my day job is a philanthropic foundation that's actually based here in Princeton. We are above the J. Crew, but we're focused on improving the quality of public policy decision-making across the Garden State. And I am also a Jersey boy through and through. I was born in South Orange, New Jersey. I went to the College of New Jersey, the current College of New Jersey, for undergrad. I went to Blousy and Rutgers for grad school, and so I have always and only lived in this state. But it's a pleasure and honor to be invited here today to moderate this conversation, which will cover some of the difficult history of various institutions in Princeton when it comes to slavery and racial segregation. We are, of course, very fortunate to be joined by several wonderful leaders today who have been deeply engaged in researching and uncovering these histories and how they have influenced the evolution of Princeton both physically and culturally. These panelists are also helping to lead various efforts to determine how the Princeton community can both authentically engage with these histories and move forward in a manner that advances justice and healing. So let me introduce these wonderful people, and then we can get into the conversation. So first, furthest away from me to your left is Sharece Blakney. She is a historical researcher and archival consultant who focuses on enslaved people, particularly women in early America, African-American history, and the Black experience. Currently, she acts as the historical research consultant for the Morven Museum Gardens, research consultant for Bartram's Garden, and project archivist for Rutgers University-Camden. Thank you for being here. Next is Gordon McCoskey, who is the Associate Professor of Christian Education at the Princeton Theological Seminary. His research and teaching interests focus on Christian education, the sacraments, the doctrine of the Trinity, and practical theology. He has written and edited several books, including With Piety and Learning, The History of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, 1812 to 2012, with Richard R. Osmer. And he serves as the editor for Theology Today as the director of the PhD program at the seminary. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Michelle Minter, who is the Vice Provost for Institutional Equity and Diversity at Princeton University. In this role, she oversees the university's strategic initiatives focused on diversity, inclusion, and access for all campus populations, and serves as Chief Compliance Officer for Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity, Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and her many volunteer commitments have included service on the boards of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education and the Princeton Theological Seminary. Thank you for being here. And next we have Grace McEwen Kimbrough, who was born and raised here in Princeton with origins in the Princeton area going back on her paternal side of the family to the 1870 census and on her maternal side to their arrival around 1920. She was employed for 28 years with the Superior Court of New Jersey Probation Department as a senior probation officer, managing sensitive and confidential issues in this field with people convicted of criminal acts. For 15 years, she worked in juvenile probation, supporting many initiatives and programs such as the Cognitive Skills Program and Jim Brown's Mayor I Can program. For the last 14 years, she has worked with adult probationers, managing a specialized caseload of mental health, domestic violence, and sex offenders. Her work within the community includes speaking at events such as the Joint Effort Safe Streets and representing the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church within the Bending the Moral Our Courageous Conversation series, which is a joint group that focuses on closing the racial divide. Thank you so much for being here. And so each panelist is going to have up to 10 minutes. We've been very specific about up to 10 minutes to share their involvement with the research on the history of these institutions and sort of actions that they are taking to pursue reparative and restorative justice. So we will start with Sharece on the Morven Institute, and then hear from Gordon on the seminary, then Michelle on Princeton University, and then end with Grace on Bending the Moral Arc. And then after that, we'll discuss some of the common themes that arise throughout those presentations, and we will work very hard to ensure that there's at least 20 minutes for Q&A with all of you at the end of the program. But without further ado, Sharece, the floor is yours to start with your presentation.
Can you hear me? Yep. Great. Okay, so we're going to take about 2 years and 900 hours worth of information, and we're going to do it in 10 minutes. So we're going to cover 3 non-consecutive generations of Richard Stockton, and we sort of grouped them by the settler, the guy who bought the land from William Penn that Morven now sits on, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and then his son, the Duke, and then we'll look at the Duke's son, the Commodore. So slaveholding in the Stockton family is about as old as the Stockton family in Princeton. The signer who purchased the land that Morven was built on, in his will, he leaves a woman named Dinah to his brother-in-law. Dinah had 6 children during the time in which he enslaved her, and each of her children were left in his will to one of his children. On the right side, there is a tax rateable. Because for tax purposes, you only had to claim able-bodied men who were essentially working, we don't have an accurate assessment of how many people were enslaved at Morven during the signer of the Declaration of Independence time. However, based on his letters between his wife, names that come up in other records, we were able to start to compile a list. He did say in his will that he would free those he found worthy, their attitudes, dispositions, the work they did. However, he died before he could. He did list in his will that he would leave it up to Annis to free anyone she believed was deserving of freedom. As far as records go, we only found her freeing one person. His name was Marcus Marsh, And Marcus was born at Morven. Annis acted as his wet nurse. And so they had a very special relationship. Once he was freed, he moved to Philadelphia. They continued to correspond by letters. But we don't have records that anyone else was freed at Morven. Based on their letters, we try to let them speak for themselves as often as possible on the topic. In one of his letters, he wrote to Annis to tell the servants, if they behave well, I will reward them when I return, and if ill, I will punish them. So this is Richard the Duke. He, like his father, continued the practice of slavery at Morven. On the left, he is the chairman or president of the Princeton Association, and this is an organization that's meant to help magistrates in the suppression of vice and the support of good order. In this newspaper clipping, it's recapping a recent meeting that they had. And in that meeting, it was determined that they were going to encourage Princeton residents not to purchase items from African-American merchants without written proof from their masters or mistresses that they had permission to sell. And so while this may be regulating vice and the support of good order, it also means that free Black business owners are not getting any patrons. This article or newspaper clipping also, in the second paragraph, it lists names that you may have recognized from Ms. Shirley's presentation. Some of them are Simpson, Robeson, Stryker, and Voorhees. We also later in our research found several Black residents in Princeton sharing surnames with these men as well. Some of them were also listed in documents registering the births of enslaved children. And like his father, he did a lot of writing back and forth with his wife. In a letter, he wrote, your domestics do middling well, as the saying is. Miss Fan is a little like her old father, Houghton. She does little else but potter about and blow the bellows. Your girl Batty improves and is very faithful. And as for Miss Susan, she is good for nothing, but we do very well. So, according to New Jersey's Gradual Abolition Act of 1804, enslavers had to register the birth of any children born to women that they owned, because when those children, if they were girls, at the age of 21, they had to be manumitted, and if they were boys, at the age of 25. And so these are two birth records where Richard Stockton the Duke registers, on the left, a girl named Kate, born to a woman he enslaved named Nancy, and on the right, a boy named Anthony, born to a woman he owned named Phyllis. For Kate, her birth registration, she's born September 14th of 1804. She is not manumitted on time. She's actually spends 3 additional years at Morven. I don't know if this is sort of a planned thing or not. However, he dies in 1828, and that's when she receives her freedom. His son manumits her in 1828, and she essentially disappears from records. Anthony on the right, who should have been manumitted in 1831, shows up in no additional records. So I can't confirm whether or not he was manumitted. This is Robert Phillips Stockton. So the guy we just discussed, this is his son. He doesn't begin to have Southern holdings after his marriage. Before he's married, when his father dies in 1828, he actually inherits 20,000 acres of land in Buncombe County, North Carolina. After looking a bit of where he owned the land, it was mining land. And he owned that land jointly with the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Princeton. In 1823, he marries Harriet Mariah Potter from Charleston. She's the only daughter of a wealthy merchant. We're going to do merchant like this. His father-in-law, John Potter, gives him a plantation in Glenn County, Georgia. And in addition to the plantation, he gives him $48,000 so that he can buy people to work the plantation. So in New Jersey, he's not holding anyone in bondage anymore. He's manumitted Kate. There's another man that his father owned named Hannibal, who was also manumitted after his father died. However, he does, like his in-laws, he does ship people from his plantation in Georgia to his home in Princeton as needed. He also purchased 330 acres of gold mining land in Flavanna County, Virginia, and he brought 17 people from his Georgia plantation to Virginia. He also employed English and German immigrants to work that land with them. So we found the deeds of purchase for the people that he purchased for the plantation in Georgia. It's across 2 separate transactions, and again, totaling roughly $48,000. But the first transaction in 1827 is for 44 people, and we were able to find their names. The second transaction, which took place 4 days later, was for an additional 64 people. Total of the 108 people he purchased from a man named Ray Sands and William Sinclair, 39 of them were children under the age of 10. And so how does Robert Phil Stockton marrying into a slaveholding family in the South have any bearing on us talking about this conversation in Princeton? And it's because, as Jill Berry, formerly of Morven, used to say, follow the money. So on the left is a deed of sale. When we say that his father-in-law, John Potter, was a merchant, he was definitely bringing in things based on newspaper ads, rum from different places, blankets from places in Europe. However, he was also bringing in people. And so he would bring people in on the ship, and then he would sell them right in port. This is from him bringing in 108 Angolans, and he sold 3 of them to a man named Henry Bailey. And in this deed, their names are Wu, Gomba, and Beta. But in the deed, and it's hard to read, he changes their names to John, Leah, and Isaac. On the right, that is an image of the Delaware and Raritan Canal. It was a pet project of Robert Phillips Stockton and his father, but in his father's lifetime, he was never able to get it through. And so in order to get the company established, he ends up having to, after the New Jersey legislature approves the incorporation of the Delaware and Raritan Company, he has to sell 5,000 shares of this company in order to get the charter approved. And of course, he does not. But he goes to his father-in-law, who buys 4,800 shares in the company, and they're able to get their charter validated. And so when we talk about how he's able to break ground on the canal in 1834, it is because he's able to go to his father-in-law to get the money that he needs to get the company done. But where did his father-in-law get the money for that? In addition to importing people and other goods, by 1808, when Congress outlaws the importation of enslaved Africans, John Potter switches gears. Wasn't very lucrative if you can't bring in the most expensive thing you can sell. And so he purchases a plantation in Savannah, Georgia. He also goes into banking. He starts in banking in Savannah. However, he eventually makes his way to working for the Bank of the United States. And while he's doing that, his plantation that he purchased blows up. He has hundreds of people. He's making tons of money. And then he decides, when his daughter marries a guy in Princeton, New Jersey, he and his wife are going to retire, and they're going to come to Princeton, New Jersey. He splits the plantation between his sons. And so they start off life with a fully functioning, very lucrative plantation. This is one son. The second son is Thomas Fuller Potter. He and his brother take the plantation that their father split between them, and they start to add to it. And so over time, they're purchasing up the land and people around their plantation, to the point where by the time he dies, in 1858, I want to say, they own 8 miles worth of plantation land along the Savannah River. And they're essentially keeping it going, but their father is able to sustain himself by money that he had saved because he only gave them the plantation and the people. The house on the right, when their father first came to Princeton, he purchased Prospect Farm, which sits on Princeton University campus. When he dies in 1842, he leaves him Prospect. He then takes and tears down the house on Prospect and builds a new one with money that he got from Coleraine Plantation that he got from his father and Tweedside Plantation that he purchased himself. With that money, he builds a new house, and eventually the house does end up in the possession of the university. But while he's here, he travels back and forth between his plantation in Savannah and Princeton. When he's away, though, his brother stays in Savannah, and he keeps very detailed records of how much he owes him when he gets back, because he's running his brother's plantation while he's away. In 1834, Robert Phillips Stockton, so the Commodore, and his father-in-law made substantial donations to the fund that constructed Trinity Church in Princeton. The prosperity brought by their different investments that they made from money from enslaving people helped them to create a $10,000 endowment for the church, and John Potter funded the construction of a new house for the church's rector. So for about 3 decades, the Stocktons and Potters consistently donated money and at times land to sustain Trinity Church, and were influential in church decision-making process. And John Potter, his wife Catherine, both of the men we talked about that he split his plantation between, and then several generations after them, are all buried at Trinity Church. And I don't know if that was 10 minutes or not, but I'm done. Okay. Do you need those? All right.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, please.
So Princeton Seminary was founded in 1812, but Presbyterian presence in Princeton actually started around where Neshaminy Mall is. If you go on Route 1 and you're getting onto the Pennsylvania Turnpike, there was a log cabin there, and the tenant family produced firebrand Presbyterian ministers. In fact, they were so evangelical that the Presbytery of Philadelphia created a new presbytery to contain them and limit the damage. It eventually moved, as we heard, to Newark and then to Princeton. The purpose of the College of New Jersey, or now Princeton University, originally was to train Presbyterian ministers. But as the university expanded, fewer and fewer people went into ministry, and so the Presbyterian Church got concerned about this, decided there needed to be a school just to train pastors for the Presbyterian Church. They decided to put it in Princeton. That's a whole other story. But anyway, the land for the seminary came from the Stockton family. They gave the land for the seminary, and the College of New Jersey and the seminary were all run by Presbyterian ministers, and there was a lot of partnership and back and forth conversation. The first 3 professors at Princeton Seminary owned slaves or rented slaves, but they didn't really like slavery. They were troubled by it, and they wouldn't at the same time condemn it, though, because in the New Testament, Paul's writings say, if you're a master of slaves, you should be a kind master, and if you're a slave, you should be an obedient master. So they wouldn't condemn slavery. They were really afraid of division in the church between North and South, and civil war maybe. So they came up with a different plan. Actually, it was somebody who grew up in Princeton and graduated from the College of New Jersey at the age of 16, became a Presbyterian minister, and then served in Basking Ridge for a number of years before moving to Georgia. And Robert Finley came to town, his hometown, and he met with professors at the seminary and the College of New Jersey and said, I think I have a plan for how to solve the slavery problem. Colonization. So the seminary, with help from the College of New Jersey, basically came up with and supported the idea of Liberia in West Africa. And Robert Stockton, who was a captain at that point before Commodore, working for the US Navy, went to West Africa and held a gun to a king's head and said, either you give us this land or I'll blow your head off. So Liberia was founded on that basis. And the American Colonization Society, which was co-founded by Robert Finley, was started in 1816. The idea was white Presbyterians and then other denominations would raise money to send freed slaves to West Africa. And that would accomplish three purposes. One, it would hasten the end of slavery. Two, it would atone for, this is kind of the first round of reparations in Princeton, for the slave trade by sending African people back to Africa. Of course, the people who are African, who are now African Americans, said, I don't know anything about Africa. I was born in Philadelphia. And why would I go to Africa? Why don't you go back to Germany or England or something? And so that wasn't really popular. But there were about 16,000 African Americans who did go to Liberia. There were a lot of early supporters of the American Colonization Society, famous people, but by about 1830, most other Americans dropped it and they realized this was never going to work. They could do the math. There's 4 million slaves, and they'd only been able to raise enough money to send a handful of people. But Princeton Seminary faculty didn't give up, and they were raising money until at least 1880 to continue to send African Americans to Liberia. This was their middle way idea. They thought this will avoid violence and it will encourage people to go to Africa who will now be Christian, and so they'll Christianize the entire continent. They'll also be democratic Republicans. They'll be Americans, basically, in their mentality, and they'll spread democracy across all of Africa. So they had very big imagination about what God was going to do through freed slaves sent to Liberia. They couldn't, of course, imagine God doing big things in America, like making black and white equal people. In fact, the first professor at the seminary, Archibald Alexander, wrote a ton of books. The largest book he ever wrote was 650 pages of propaganda supporting the American Colonization Society. And in that book, he says, it's almost a direct quote, it would take 1,000 years for white and black people in America to live together in peace, comma. However, even then, one group would just have to leave. So he's basically saying it's never going to happen. And this was the seminary's mentality. We uncovered all this partly because the black student group in about 2015 was asking for some kind of historic audit of what the background of the seminary was. It was always very hush-hush and forgotten conveniently. Also, I was working on a book on the history of practical theology at Princeton Seminary with a colleague, and I drew the short straw and got the 19th century. So I spent a couple of summers in the archives reading 19th century handwriting, and I discovered they were kind of preoccupied with the slavery question and what to do about that. And they had other things to say, but Liberia was their big answer. So in the interest of time, we're going to cut out a lot of stuff. So we uncovered all of this and then wrote it up and talked about it. And it actually changed the way Princeton Seminary functions in a lot of ways, partly just telling the story. I was a student there and I got 2 degrees there, and then I was on the faculty for at least 10 years. I had heard not a word about any of this, and it was all just forgotten. And we would have race tensions and issues that would come up when I was a student and then even on the faculty, and it was always managed. And it would the idea was to make it calm down and go away. But once we did the slavery audit, it changed the dynamics so that there was a context in-house for these conversations. And we don't just manage things now. But we also had an implementation committee that said, okay, here's the story. What are we going to do to respond to this? Well, we can't fix it. But we can do some things to try to symbolically do some reparation and repair. So we did quite a few things, not enough, and we're still working on it, but we created scholarships for master's level students. We created one line in our 10 PhD admits per year that's devoted to studying African American history and slavery and race issues. We have a new faculty member that's a position that's going to, the person that's been filled, but the person starting next fall to study African American history. we had a Black Church Studies program, but it wasn't very well funded, so we bolstered that because we didn't want this report to just be read and then put on the shelf. We wanted it to be an ongoing conversation. So we're doing ongoing research. We had a conference in Liberia, actually, with partners and friends there, and also at Howard Divinity School about the transatlantic aspects of the slave trade. We took the name off of the chapel of one of the slave-owning early professors, and now we just call it the chapel, which is better than what it was, because African American students would walk into the chapel named after somebody who couldn't even imagine them being there or didn't really want them there. But ironically, Princeton Seminary has the first theological school graduate who was African American in the United States. And one of the things we did was we named our ginormous theological library after him, Theodore Cedric Wright, who graduated from Princeton Seminary in 1828. So it's kind of contradictory and ironic, but we have the Wright Library, and across the street we have the Alexander Hall, the guy who was the first professor and who thought the answer was Liberia, side by side, and that's kind of the history of the seminary. We're still working on these matters. And one thing, just to close, that I realized that this was not the end of the story. It's just kind of opening a whole series of conversations. And we have graduates who are Native American, and we are now embarking on an inquiry into what is the seminary's role in the boarding schools in America. And it turns out that we have the guy who was the architect in Protestantism of the boarding school movement, Sheldon Jackson. And when I was working on the slavery audit, I discovered a book that was really helpful called Bind Us Apart. And it was about how the colonization scheme for African Americans and the removal scheme for Native Americans are actually two sides of the same coin. They're actually deeply interconnected with white supremacy and, quote, civilization. Whenever I see the term civilization now, or civilized, I get very nervous because that's code for white supremacy. In any case, we're now embarking on that, and at the university and working closely with Michelle, they're also working on these questions. We have intersecting realities between Morven, the university, the seminary, on African American and slavery issues, but also the Native American boarding school issue.
What a perfect lead-in. So I'm going to approach this a little differently. I'm very grateful to my fellow panelists and to Shirley, who have made many references to the history of the university, which is sort of mixed into all of this. Instead of telling you about that history, what I want to comment on is how we think about and are informed by our history when we are making decisions at the university. So we don't use the term reparations to talk about what we do at the university. We find that to be it's a term that means different things to different people, and I think if we asked everyone in this room what they think reparations are, we'd get quite a lot of answers. But we do talk, the university has a strong sense of obligation. Our informal model is that we're in the service of humanity, and we very much consider ourselves to be informed by our history as we think about what those obligations are. My office runs a program called the History and Sense of Place Initiative, that has done a lot of work over the past decade to try and surface the history of the university, particularly those parts that were suppressed or ignored, people who were not honored, and the things that for a very long time the university just didn't want to talk about or didn't think were important. So you've already heard some references to the Princeton and Slavery Project, which was quite an extraordinary research project, and there's a huge website that I encourage you to look at. It's really fascinating. We did the research that discovered that the first 9 presidents of Princeton owned slaves, and then we put up the marker in front of McLean House, as well as named the spaces after James Collin Johnson and Betsy Stockton on the campus. We've also looked at Woodrow Wilson's legacy, and as many of you probably know, we took his name off of the policy school and off of a residential college. We've paid a lot of attention to our history with the Lenape people. And worked with the federally recognized Lenape sister tribes to develop a historical marker, and there's a memorial garden. in honor of the Lenape on campus. Just to give you a smaller example, we last year named an arch after an alumnus named Kentaro Ikeda, who was our only Japanese student during the Second World War, and he was literally interned on the campus. So we've tried to bring out a lot of different kinds of stories. We think the university should be a place where we are willing to grapple with some of those historical complexities and sit with the discomfort that may bring us, because that's what we should do on college campuses. We also have tried to make sure that we're doing some of the celebrating of history that we should be celebrating. One of my happiest days a few years ago was when we named a building in honor of Laura Wooten, who was a Trenton resident and had worked in dining services for years, and she was the longest-serving poll worker in America. So, you know, there are difficult stories, and there are also celebratory stories. So as we've tried to think about how we're informed by that history, how does it shape the choices we make now on campus, our history of inclusion, which was absolutely a long part of the university's history, it really does inform our commitment to make sure that now we are creating access for people from all backgrounds. So we have dramatically increased the number of low-income students. Our Pell-eligible students are at 21% now. We just launched a program that only takes transfer students from community college and military veterans. We have very strong partnerships with HBCUs, research partnerships, and a program that trains HBCU students for archival research and museum studies. So we've really tried to build out those relationships with the knowledge that we, for many years, didn't admit Black students. We've worked to build some really strong relationships and continue to work to build relationships with the Lenape sister nations and the state-recognized tribes that are still based here in New Jersey. And that is a place where we still have a lot of work to do. And we've built out our college pathway programs. We do a lot of outreach to students who will never come to Princeton because we just believe that that higher education is a really powerful tool. So we run outreach programs that reach districts all over the country and thousands of students and families all over the country. So what we've tried to do is understand that because this was an area of our failure in the past, we really need to try and be informed by it and make decisions based on it in the present. I wanted to stress that the way we think of this, we don't think of this as transactional. So we are not doing these things because of our past historical failures. I hope we would do them anyway, but we try and keep them in mind. We try and approach them with humility and therefore to sort of demand creativity of ourselves as we think about it. So I'll stop there.
May 20th, 2020, May 25th, 2020. Anybody know what that date is? May 25th, 2020. That's the day George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Bending the Moral Arc is a group that splintered from the death of George Floyd. And that group is made up of parishioners from Nassau Presbyterian Church and Witherspoon Presbyterian Church. And it was a struggle. The beginning of that group was a struggle. You had people from different cultures, different backgrounds, believing in different things. So we had to start with policing. A lot of them didn't know the history of policing. The first police started in the 1700s. They were the slave patrols that went after runaway slaves. So once you start and then you do a timeline, you go up to the late 1800s. After the Civil War, Reconstruction, you had more Black or African Americans, whatever you want to call them, in Congress and Senate than we do today. So what happens? Jim Crow. They cut everything out. So these are the topics we've discussed, and we brought it back to Princeton. Shirley didn't get a chance to talk about it, but Paul Robeson Street was called Jackson Street. It was all black families. They went all the way up to Nassau Street. John Street went all the way up to Nassau. They cut it out because they did Palmer Square years ago. So they gentrified the whole black neighborhood. I grew up in that neighborhood. It was black and Italians. Growing up, we went to school together. We shared recipes together. We laughed together. We played together. And it was a separate Princeton. There were two separate Princetons growing up. I grew up from kindergarten. My parents were born and raised here. As Shirley said, my family on my paternal side goes back. They're on the 1870 census, so they're before then, because that was the first census in the United States. And on that census, it said farm labor, right? It listed the farm labor, and I'm saying, okay, 5 years before that was the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So farm labor, that means before that they were slaves. So they don't want to call them slaves. And what we found out in 2020 is a significant year, because my niece found my grandmother on a census that said she owned a farm outright and it was paid for here in Princeton. So I got with Shirley and we met with the state historian, because I went to Trenton, looked up the archives. There were 10 years missing. So we find out that Carnegie took all the farms in that part of Princeton and made Carnegie Lake. He took them from people and made Carnegie Lake and donated to Princeton University. We got all that information sent to us. We met with not only the state historian in Kingston, there's a state preserve where the farm was that the state owns now. So with this committee with Bending Arc, we have tackled topic after topic on a monthly basis. And what have we done from that committee? We have a splinter committee that's working on the 13th Amendment. They didn't end slavery if you read the 13th Amendment. Read the 13th Amendment carefully. It says slavery is ended unless you commit a crime. You can be a slave or an indentured servant. So we are definitely working on getting that off of the state amendment, state of New Jersey. And over the last 5 years, the committee has gone from here to here. Why? Because we listen to each other. And I take this bottle, and if this was a pitch dark room and I shine the light on it, and I shine that light long enough, you'll see that it's a bottle of water. And I think over the last 5 years, but with us shining the light on certain incidents and certain systemic racism and certain educational failures in this country and in Princeton alone, once you shine that light long enough, they start to see that these things really exist. They're no longer swept under the carpet. So this committee, these two committees have come together and we're working on issue after issue. I wasn't able to attend the last meeting 2 weeks ago, which was on Martin Luther King, but them having the inauguration on the day they celebrated his birthday. And I think a lot of people don't know that Martin Luther King lived in Camden, New Jersey, while he attended Philadelphia Theological Seminary, which no longer exists. His first court case was in Burlington County Superior Court. He went into a bar, him and his roommate. It was the only place open on a Sunday for them to eat. It was a restaurant/bar in Maple Shade, New Jersey. And the owner pulled out a gun. He was the bartender and the owner. And he pulled out a gun. And he went outside and he shot in the air. Martin Luther King went down to the police station and he filed charges. They waived that, sent it up from municipal court to superior court. His roommate dropped the charges, but he went through court, but then he dropped the charges. And they think, there's a court document of the whole case. They think he did it because he didn't want his father to know that he got in some trouble while he was here. Well, in an incident with somebody white coming out of Georgia. So these are some of the things that we study and we learn on this Bending the Moral Arc committee. And we're trying to work to bridge the gap of knowledge, because there's one side of what we know as African Americans, how we grew up and what we're taught, and then there's another side. So those are the things, like I said, we're working on. I'm actually on a committee at Princeton High with the principal and vice principal for a leadership program. And it's a cultural leadership program. So it's trying to just bridge that gap, make things interesting. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you for keeping on time. We're great. We're doing really good. So just a few things to bring up. I mean, throughout your sort of presentations and discussions, obviously there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into what you're doing. It's a tremendous amount of resources. And I think this is very unique for the state of New Jersey, what you're doing. I know that similar efforts exist in Newark. I can't think of any effort that exists in this way across this many different institutions in a municipality in New Jersey. And I don't know if everyone's aware, but there has been an effort statewide to advance reparations in legislation that has been going on for quite a number of years. It actually has been going on so long that the original sort of copy of the bill was introduced in the legislature. And since then, California introduced a bill, passed the bill, did analysis on what the program would look like, and instituted the program. And we still just have a copy of a bill. So we've been lapped by California on this effort at the state level. But I think an important takeaway here is that there's a need to really try to spread the type of work that you all are doing at a local level to really understand how this has manifested in this city, in this municipality, how it has shaped the town physically and culturally, and what it means for not just current residents, but future residents. And so I guess one big question I would have for each of you is, what has been the most difficult part of this, of what you have done? Has it been the difficulty of finding information? Has it been the difficulty of even pursuing this work or bringing up these topics within your institutions and your community? Has it been trying to get more people to be aware of it? What has been the most challenging thing for you as you have pursued this? And whoever would like to start.
I think so far, the most difficult part has been finding people who, in our case, going back of the late 18th century, and then trying to find them after they've been manumitted, where they're not really showing up in public records, and so you're looking at them. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're looking for them on the edge of the lives of people we knew they would have been associated with. For example, you know that this person was enslaved by a specific person. And so instead of going directly to an archive and being able to look them up, because as Ms. Shirley reminded us, sometimes they did not have last names, you would have to go looking for John N. Simpson, who we know was associated with the Duke, who lived at Morven. We know that eventually Hannibal, who's manumitted, who's owned by the Duke, he goes by Hannibal Simpson when he's freed. But the process of trying to find him is almost impossible, and you have to pull up, it takes a lot of historical context. You have to know which census he would be in after he's manumitted. You would have to know starting locally and then build out, the process itself is very time consuming. And I know for a lot of people who may want to do that work specifically for their family histories, it's almost impossible because the barrier isn't just time, it isn't just having enough knowledge of background, but it's also you may need to travel. You live in the North, but you could have family who started in South Carolina or Georgia or any other big slaveholding state. And so those are those are barriers that I have noticed.
I think the biggest challenge for us has been not so much telling the story and surfacing it, but what do we do with it? So we require every student and every faculty member and member of the administration who comes into the seminary community to read the slavery audit and to reflect on it. That's fine, but it can also become kind of rote. The question is, how do we help them, new people, new students, think self-critically and on the one hand, and become self-aware of the assumptions that are deeply embedded in various ways, but also to think constructively and imaginatively about a better future. So I think our challenge is to have this not just be something that we're kind of used to now. We really want it to be a lever for thinking creatively, because we can look back at the people in the 19th century. Pretty much everybody in the seminary community is like, yeah, I don't know how they could think that way. You know, we obviously that was wrong, a bunch of stuff that they did. But then I realized, and several other people realized too, that 100 years from now, they're going to say that about us. Like, how could they not be dealing with, and you fill in the blank? What I realized is that in the 19th century, race and slavery issues were not peripheral at the seminary. By looking at the archives, they were talking about it a lot. They just, I think, had a stunted imagination. They had imagination, but it was the wrong kind or not very bold. So, I mean, we're not immune from that. So the biggest challenge is how do we foster the right kind of imagination today about the real issues? And it's not like racism is gone. That's still a live issue. But we have also environmental issues. We have gun violence. There's a lot of issues that we're concerned about. And I'd like to get to the place where 100 years from now, people said, well, you know, that community, they actually wrestled with that and they did some stuff that was constructive. I don't want them, the people in the future to say, yeah, they talked about it, but they came to the wrong conclusions or they didn't do anything. That's the hard part.
I think one of the big problems that we've seen at the university is that people deeply love the narrative that they already know. And so our alumni are passionate about the university and they want to believe in its virtue. And so they are far more drawn to the story about the Continental Congress meeting at Nassau Hall than about the slave auction on the lawn. They want to think about Woodrow Wilson as a wonderful internationalist who, signed the Versailles Treaty, rather than someone who resegregated the civil service. And people don't like to grab. We're going through it now around John Witherspoon's legacy. People are. We don't like complication. And in fact, I think we don't like it on either side. So John Witherspoon is a really complicated character. Gordon was part of our convening on that, who had some really good qualities and some really bad qualities. And the fact that you can't put him in one camp or another and say he was an entirely good man or an entirely awful man is hard for some people to sit with. So, we continue to try and hold the complexity of it and to kind of push ourselves around getting comfortable with our own discomfort.
That's what I find the most challenging, what she just said, discomfort. Mm-hmm. And on our committee, we talked about reparations. We had people, we don't like that word. We want a different word. Restoration, we don't like that word. So I'm sitting back thinking, I'm going back in history, and I'm like, okay, every time we moved up two steps, you moved the goalpost, changed the name. You had civil rights. You made women's rights. You had affirmative action. You made DEI. So every time we do that, you move the pole. And so our argument was, I was hard on this. I said, I'm not changing. I like the word reparations. We don't have to change for you. You did this to our folks. We don't have to change. You have to accept it. Stop hiding behind the ball like it didn't happen. They always want to change the narrative. And that's the most challenging. And I think we came to agreement with the group because we had people, they really hated that name 5 years ago. Today, they accept it. But like I said, you shine a light on it long enough.
That's actually one of the sort of background stories of the statewide effort. Is the campaign is called Say the Name, because the Speaker of the Assembly requested Ryan Haygood, who's the Executive Director and President of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Ryan, reparations is such a charged word. Can't we say something else? And I came to the same conclusion. It doesn't matter what the name is. The issue that you have is what the idea is. And you can call it whatever you want, but as long as you struggle to accept and embrace the idea, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And so the statewide effort has been rooted in this idea and this sort of very clear statement of say the name. Let's be clear about what we're talking about. Let's not shy away from the reality of the issue, and let's figure out how can we actually accomplish the things that we're trying to move forward with. I want to make sure we have 20 minutes for Q&A, and so I'll ask one last question, and then, for folks in the audience, please engage. It would be silly, I think, to not ask a question about where we are today as a nation, right? And a lot of the things that you're exploring and spending a lot of time engaging with are things that seemingly the majority of the nation struggles with at best and rebukes at worst, right? And there's been some comments about how this is not exactly new. We've been here before. We've been through Reconstruction. We've had the backlash of Jim Crow. Then we've had the Civil Rights era. Then we've had a backlash to that. And now we are in a bit of another retrenchment and backlash. And so do you think of how what you're doing here can sort of ground future efforts throughout the rest of the country? Because there is going to need to be restoration from this moment, right? We are seeing a lot of attacks on DEI and other principles of equity and justice. And I like to believe in the idea that the pendulum always swings back. So as we try to, till the soil for when that pendulum swings, how do you think about your work and what it could mean for leading or being a leading example for the rest of the nation or other institutions?
Well, I think it's going to get worse in the short term before it gets any better. I think it will get better. The demographics in the United States are changing, and so that will change how we talk about things. I think this is a backlash moment. White supremacy and conservative Protestants supporting that for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's going to be this way forever. But I think there's an issue about jobs in small towns and in rural places. There's a lot of Americans, a lot of white Americans who are upset that the American dream's not working for them, and that's what fuels, in my theory, a lot of the support for the current, I will say, regime. And I don't know what the seminary is going to do to help people create jobs. I mean, we're talking about other stuff, but I think we have to figure out how to create jobs besides Walmart. Good paying jobs. When there's a lot of prosperity and people are not afraid or feeling defensive, it's easier to live with your neighbor who's different than you. But when there's economic stress, then you start thinking scapegoats and all the old American white supremacist stuff comes back into play. And I don't know what's going to happen about the economic part of it. I think that racial composition and the way we talk in some ways will be better in a few years. It's going to be worse for a short time. But I don't know what we're going to do about the economic shifts. And that's what fuels a lot of the hatred and backlash and intensity. I don't have the answer for that, but I also don't hear anybody talking about job creation either.
Yeah, thoughts about how, with your experience in your institutions, are there things that people could take from what you've pursued? Or what would be the one thing you'd want people to take from what you've pursued and what you've worked on? Yeah.
I would hope that it's a sense of self and foundational information. The history that you may have started with in school that they tell you about someone who looks like you may not be exactly all there is to know. And once you know so much or any of what came before that, your sense of self can and will change. And so I'm hoping that the idea is we have done enough research to be able to start a conversation and share information. I think the simplest, and it may not be fair to say easy, but I think the simplest things that a lot of institutions can do is share what they know. Everything and everywhere has an archive. This library has an archive. And so just sharing what you have, making it available so that people can start to do their own search, that could be a game changer for a lot of communities.
I would start off by saying if it's new, it's not true. And if it's true, it's not new. So that's with history, that's with a whole lot of things. And what you were talking about in the times we're in today, I have to tell my friends, stop giving power to somebody that you think is in charge. That's an avatar. 2025, that project came out during the Reagan administration, backlash to the civil rights movement. That's how old it is, but they've been working on it. They just needed a face to fit it. And so when people understand that, you can take and look at what needs to be done in this country. As far as employment in the rural areas, they're in trouble. It's a lot of drugs. Being in the criminal justice field, it's a lot of drugs in rural West Virginia, in the small little towns, in rural Minnesota, in rural Nebraska. There's a lot of drugs. And that's not the answer. So something's going to happen. We just have to be ready. Something's going to happen. All those that voted for him, I got messages from relatives in Georgia and different states. They're paying $10 for a dozen eggs. So when this hits those rural areas, there's going to be a rebellion. They're going to be hungry. They're going to want to eat. So we just have to sit back and see what we can do to help when that happens.
Yeah, you heard in my biography, I work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm the university's chief diversity officer. This is a really rough climate that we're in. I would encourage you to pay attention and sort of track against the actual content of the various executive orders and things that are coming out. I think it really is important to educate yourself. There's a lot of chaos, but there's also some really cruel and concerning things that are happening. I think we need to pay a lot of attention to young people. If we lose this generation, if we educate this generation, if they are our future, they are going to be the leaders of the future. But we also have a mental health crisis in this country, and they are getting an enormous amount of misinformation from social media. So we really need to pay attention to investing in the well-being of this generation that is going to that has a lot of passion, but also needs a lot of support.
I'll quickly say, so I teach a class at Rutgers School, which is the planning and policy school, which is my alma mater, on racial wealth gap. And I taught it last semester, so during the election. And I had about 16 graduate students, one undergrad who was wonderful. And they were so scared as people who are going into a field that is ostensibly for public interest, right? And they don't know what to believe, and they don't know if the things that they've been told about their country actually are true, or if they even mean anything anymore, right? And so thinking about, yes, the future generation, and how do we ensure that we are supporting them as they step into this world and begin to have responsibility, it's a major issue, and it's a very important one. And the thing that I used to say to them all the time was, A, you can't eat the whole elephant at once, so pick your thing and work on that thing. But I would share this Baldwin quote with them about how, given that there's this isolation crisis and this loneliness crisis, that, you think, there's a Baldwin quote that says, you think that your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. And it was books that taught me that the things that tormented me the most were the very thing that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive, right? And so holding these histories, having these archives, protecting these archives, and making sure that they are not destroyed is incredibly important as we move forward in this moment, because the history is what will guide us to the next point. So thank you to you all very much. I see we got two wonderful folks who have microphones, so if anyone has questions they would like to ask the panel. Here, over there. Yeah, you could just say your name. Oh.
Is it on?
There you go.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this. It's so I love it. Thank you so much, University representative, and all of you. I really appreciate it. And Sister Shirley, thank you so much. I was riveted by that. I don't really have a question. I really just have more of a comment. Like, I think we have kind of gotten past around that corner where we're just like talking, and it feels great, and not in our town, and Black History Month is coming up, and we're going to have probably a few more events like this, hopefully. I just don't know if it's enough, and particularly with this new administration. And I'm not so much concerned about him, because he can write executive orders, but it's what follows. It's the people who respond, or the people who react, and all of that storm that's coming. And I'm concerned about that. I was listening to Sister Shirley about the different places that was predominantly places of color, but we can't afford it. And that affordable housing, I'm even myself impacted by that. And as a former realtor who worked for someone here locally, I'm just shocked that I'm in that position. One, I can't afford it, but how can I afford it on the income and that growing disparity that we're not really addressing, as you said, the job market. So I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that the conversations will continue and share, but at some point, what can we do to just push that forward so that the next generation doesn't have to fight so hard, so we don't have more stories of that George Floyd, who gave his life. Thank you.
Just a comment.
Okay, thank you to the panelists for the investigation and acknowledge of your institution, of the role that the Princeton have in the racial history here. It's something that we need to hear more, the institution acknowledge and ownership of that, because tend to be very tokenized and then very intellectualized. But it needs to be to the people to embrace and the responsibility. So some reparation needs to be thought through, even though that Princeton doesn't like to do that. Thank you to know In Our Town, continuous conversation, the board that have every time bring the community here to talk about these issues that are important for the community, because we need to organize. Thank you to the library and the community, because what we need to understand is that the community is the one that make possible that we move on the history. So we are the history. They are recorded the history, but we are the history. So really we need to push. We are the history. And we need to tell them in writing or oral, but we are the history. So one of the things that we cannot pass is Miss Shirley, for your dedication in bridging the community with Princeton institutions, helping many of us recognize the importance of confronting the past to build a more equitable future. And I hope that before not too long, we can see reparation in Princeton. And the question for the panelists are two. One is the importance of regular events like continuous conversation in this community to grapple with the racial history that we still have it. And number two is in this institutional work that you are doing, does it help to have a broad community like this one aware of our racial history, and if so, how we can work together to really move forward and eventually see not only tokenize, but really repair. So without reparation, we cannot move forward, like our sisters say. So thank you, and I hope that we can hear from you guys.
What's our question?
Okay. One question was on the importance of, what do you think about the importance of sort of convenings like this? Is it important to continue to have these types of convenings and community events and conversations, and then also the value of having community come together to be aware of racial history in the community? How do you view that?
Yeah, I think these kind of gatherings are really important. Thank you for organizing it, Cliff, and Not In Our Town. The challenges that we're sort of talking to the choir right now, right? Like you're folks who are interested in this topic and who were willing to take a Thursday evening to come out for it. So that's all, I think, is always the challenge, is how do you reach people who don't think they're interested, who are sure they're not interested, and get them engaged in the conversation. I don't know the answer. It's just a problem.
I think community connection is really important, but like what you were saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That's the pragmatist tagline. Talk is cheap, but what about action? And I don't know, I mean, we're at institutions of higher education, and there's a limit to some of the things we can do, but what we do is teach people. Mm-hmm. So the issue is access and support to help people to navigate the institutions that we have. And I think we're not doing enough, but both institutions are working on this to try to make it more, what we have, more available, in the idea that empowers people, it equips people to go out and, like in my case, pastors and future professors, to shape and reshape the world. There's a lot of things I want to do, but I feel like, well, I have to think about what can I do in the education realm. And that means getting more people and different kinds of people to have what we offer.
I think, excuse me, I think the State Social Justice Committee is working on reparations for the state of New Jersey. A year and a half ago, they launched in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, the committee. And they did it in Perth Amboy because that's where the slave ships came in, imported. I was there when they did it. Juneteenth of this year, 2025, they're going to come up and present to the state a proposal of reparations, how they want them, and where the money is going to come from. It's not going to come from taxpayers. So let's see what they come up with at the Juneteenth. They're going to launch it on Juneteenth, 2025. And that's one thing that you can look at. These meetings are important. Community is important. When I said Paul Robeson Street used to be Jackson Street, I grew up on John Street. My mother and her family lived on Jackson Street, which is now Paul Robeson. They tore all that down. There was a movie theater, the Playhouse, and it looked much better than the theater on Nassau Street, and it was a lot larger. They tore all that down. They moved everybody out. And when those folks left that street, they had to move to Lawrenceville, Ewing, and Trenton because they were all black. Now, the neighborhood used to have block parties. In the winter, they would put the horses out and close the street when it snowed, and the kids, we would sled down the streets. Yeah, we did all these things. It was a community, it was a family. Everyone looked out for everyone, everyone helped everyone. So I think the best thing is the more meetings they have and the more you educate others on what's going on. Because a lot of people don't know. Even that Bending the Moral Art Committee, I told you 5 years later, we're like this because a lot of them didn't know. They knew what they heard on MSNBC and CNN and Fox News. And so that's exactly what they believed, and that's what they went with.
Sharece, you should give a point. I just want to emphasize that a bit because it can sound cliche to emphasize community, but I would say in New Jersey it is more important than in most places because of the fact that our media market is so, if you're in North Jersey, New York centric, and if you're in South Jersey, Philadelphia centric, we don't really have mass communications in the way that other states or other parts of the country do. And so doing things in community at the local level actually has more impact and more effect here than it would in other places. And in this year of all years, y'all, this is a governor election year. Don't forget, right? And all the assembly is up for election. I just said that the person that was blocking the reparations effort is the head of the assembly. And so if these things are really, really, really important, showing up to that Juneteenth event and showing out in person and showing that there's real interest at the community grassroots level for these policies in a real way, it has more impact than I think folks realize and more impact than it would in other states. Yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to add, I do think these are important, if for no other reason than preparation, because when it's time to have another conversation, when it's time to talk about next steps or what do we do after this, the important part is we started with having the same amount of details. Because as you pointed out earlier, the idea of reparations means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so if we're all starting with the same information, then we can start on the same page, because otherwise you'll continue to have conversations like this because we can't agree, because we all aren't dealing with the same information.
We're not dealing with the same experience.
At all.
That's the answer. And the experience is, that's it. And that's what this group, we found out that these people's life experiences were totally different. One guy on our committee grew up in Georgia. So he had a whole different view, and he was corporate America. So he couldn't understand, a lot of you guys are criminals and this and that, but then when he started to understand, it took a while. But like I said, you got to keep shining that light so they can see. Because
it's the ripple effect.
Absolutely.
The idea where we start talking about why is it important to start a conversation with the people that the Stocktons own? Wealthy, powerful, connected. Then you turn around and you connect it to Grace lived in Princeton, Miss Shirley lived in Princeton, and you hear their stories. You know that this didn't just start when they were born. This was a conversation that started at the beginning, and you had your ripple effects.
So really quick, I have a question. So all of you have talked about the importance of educating people and sharing this information, and you talked about the younger audiences. And while these small gatherings are nice, right, we live in a digital age, right? So how are you leveraging modern communication channels to educate it? I think everyone in this room already had an interest, so you're kind of preaching to the deacons, not to steal a seminary term. But
we have
the real importance is getting this information out to people who don't know the value of it, who don't know the importance of it, and aren't making the connections. I grew up in Trenton all my life. I've gone past Henry J. Austin Health Center, seen Stockton State come up. And I'm just learning about the historical connection. So I think there's an opportunity and a challenge where these are nice, but you need to figure out how to use modern social media communication channels to get that message out. So the question is, like, have you thought about that, and how are you doing it?
Yeah, I think it's important. And I will say the university doesn't do it as well as it should. The Princeton and Slavery site is a really extraordinary site, and it comes with a complete curriculum that they use in the schools. But yeah, there's a lot more opportunity to do this through other strategies.
Sorry. That's an excellent point. Also, specifically speaking for Morven, it's a museum, and wall space is finite. So there's only but so much of this you'll be able to share on the walls in the museum, and that is something that's currently being worked on, where changes are being made as we speak, or maybe next week it starts. But the process of sort of adding some of this information to what's already there. But we've also gone through the process of writing out an entire website and putting together digital exhibits so that it can be added to Morven's website, because, as you said, and it's not just about sharing this locally, but someone who may have had a connection to the Stocktons when he owned a plantation in Georgia, they may be interested or curious about how they're connected to Princeton. Being able to do some kind of Google search to find any of this information is going to be helpful to them, whether to fulfill their curiosity or if they are doing their own research. So currently, it's the process of adding to their program curriculum, education programs, and their website.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think at this point, we actually do have to wrap up. Let's say thanks to our panelists.
Wait. Before you forget, Ms. Satterfield said that you have homework. You have to Google Princeton Plan 50 years later, right? That's part of how we extend this information. That's part of digital. We did this on Zoom, but you got to go home and also share this with your communities and your friends too. So Google Princeton Plan 50 years later. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.